Hi, everyone, and welcome to the SRHM Podcast, which explores new research and emerging trends in the field of sexual and reproductive health and rights, with a focus on using rights-based knowledge for action.
Hello, and welcome to the SRHM Podcast. My name is Mindy Jane Roseman. I'm an associate editor of the SRHM Journal, as well as the director of international law programs and the director of the Gruber Program for Global Justice and Women's Rights at Yale Law School. Today, I'm honored to be joined by three guests from Ireland who work in the field of abortion rights. First, we have Niamh Skelly, a lecturer in mental health in the Division of Mental Health, Midwifery and Health at the University of the West of Scotland in Paisley. This month, she published a paper in the SRHM Journal entitled Staying in a Punishing Place: Online Narratives About Pregnancy and Abortion in Pre-Liberalized Ireland. Her work explores the self-generated online narratives of women who've experienced crises during pregnancy while living in a restrictive context, specifically Ireland before 2019, and who did not travel to access abortion care. Our other guests are Dyuti Chakravarty, a postdoc researcher at the School of Sociology, University College Cork, and Lorraine Grimes, a postdoctoral researcher at Social Sciences Institute, Maynooth University. They co-authored the paper, Restrictive Points of Entry into Abortion Care in Ireland, a qualitative study of expectations and experiences with the service, which was published in the SRHM Journal in 2023, which focuses on access to early medical abortion care in Ireland and identifies existing barriers resulting from gaps in current policy designs. So welcome to all of you. We are really very pleased to have you here for this important discussion. Both of your papers examine the impacts of abortion laws and access in Ireland, but from different time periods and perspectives, from pre to post-liberalization. Lorraine, could you give us an overview of the current situation regarding abortion access in Ireland today, and perhaps touch on upcoming discussions in Parliament, the role of the Oireachtas Health Committee in reviewing legislation and service delivery, policy initiatives, and in anything else you might think worthwhile to share?
No problem. So abortion is currently available under a number of different sections of the Act. So it's available in the GP clinics if you are 9 weeks and 12 days from your last menstrual period. Now, not every GP in Ireland is an abortion provider. It's an opt-in service, and there is no public list. So in order to find your nearest provider, you need to call My Options Helpline, and they will direct you to your nearest one. If you are post 9 weeks and 6 days, you can have an abortion in a hospital, a maternity hospital, up to 12 weeks. There's also access in terms of fatal fetal anomaly and risk to your physical health or your mental health. Now, the interpretation of fatal fetal anomaly and risk to health are very restrictive. It's quite a conservative interpretation of the legislation, and the pathways are difficult. So many women from Ireland are still travelling abroad. That's important to note. It's also important to note that an abortion carried out in Ireland, which is not within the criteria of the law, is a criminal offence. So there is still criminalisation in the legislation if it's not carried out within the parameters of the law. So, for example, if a woman orders abortion pills online, that's not to deter anyone, but just it is an illegal act under the current legislation. So there was a review of the legislation carried out in 2022 by Mary O'Shea. Research that I did fed into this review. And I suppose the current legislative recommendations from this review are sitting with the Oireachtas Health Committee since 2022. We have asked several times when these will be on the agenda. They haven't been added to the agenda, and there seems to be very little political will from the current government to deal with the legislative recommendations. On the policy side of things, it is a little bit better. We have seen changes over the last number of years from the Department of Health, the HSE. So those carrying out the services, we have seen some recommendations being interpreted, and I know we'll talk about that later as well. But that's kind of to give a current overview right now.
And if I can just add to what Lorraine was saying in terms of the abortion policy and in terms of the nature of the law and women having to travel, just to give you an idea, in 2024, more than 200 women traveled to the UK to access abortions because they couldn't access it at home. So they would have fallen outside of the purview of sections 9, 10, 11, and 12 of the Health Termination of Pregnancy Act of 2018 and would have had to travel to the UK to access abortion. So I just wanted to plug that in.
Thank you both, Lorraine and Dyuti, for the precision of the ways in which the law does not actually seem to be working for folks in Ireland. I'm sure we'll get into more details as the conversation continues, but right now I'd like to bring Niamh into the discussion as well. Niamh, your paper explores abortion access in Ireland before liberalisation with a focus on women who did not travel for care. Why did you choose this particular group to focus on? And what do their online narratives reveal that we might otherwise overlook? This is a compound question. I've got two more that follow, so just bear with me. And the title of your paper refers to Ireland as a punishing place. That's a powerful phrase. Could you unpack what that captures in terms of the emotional, social, and psychological experiences of the women you studied?
Thanks, Mindy. I'm having to catch myself there. I was a therapist in another life. I have a tendency to and ah. I'm trying not to do that for podcast purposes. First of all, in terms of why this group, I think both in the academic literature and also during the 2018 referendum in Ireland, there is a focus on outward travel from Ireland for the purposes of abortion care. And obviously that is a very worthwhile topic of discussion, a very worthwhile phenomenon to study. However, when we take a reproductive justice lens, we are very much encouraged to think about power and about who has the most access to power and choice. And in many ways, being able to travel for the purposes of abortion care does represent a form of privilege. And so I wanted to think about those people that we maybe heard from less during the Irish referendum campaign, who, for various reasons, travel was not an option. Your second question was about kind of what these narratives bring up that has perhaps been overlooked. Certainly, again, from my own professional background, what stood out for me, although it was only in a small number of these narratives, was this issue of the attempted self-inducement of abortion. It's a form of very serious self-injury. It's associated with really high levels of distress. And there was certainly suggestion within the narratives that I looked at of an association with suicidality. I think this is an incredibly vulnerable group of people within any restrictive context. These groups exist even within non-restrictive contexts, but I think their vulnerability very much increases when we're thinking about a setting where they don't have ready, non-criminalized access to abortion care. The other issue that came up in these narratives that I think is perhaps overlooked and is really, really topical is that kind of intersection of abortion care and miscarriage care, and how women who are seeking miscarriage care can be put at risk both psychologically and physically within restrictive contexts. That in order to have physically and psychologically safe miscarriage care, we need to have ready access to high quality abortion care. The two are not separable. And Ireland is such a good example of how that plays out. We have so much existing knowledge and data from 2018 Ireland of the widespread ramifications of restrictive abortion context, including for those who weren't seeking abortion care, who were seeking miscarriage care. The last part of your question was about this notion of a punishing place. And it was a very emotionally demanding, and I'm sure the others can perhaps relate to this when I think back to their own experience of carrying it and kind of writing up their papers and doing the research. There was a real emotional heaviness to this work as I undertook it. And I was trying to put words on what that heaviness was, what in these narratives was hitting me so hard in the gut, for want of better words. And there was this just idea that came across to me of Ireland not being a place that was nurturing or caring for these women when they found themselves in need of care and nurturing. And of course, I would just add to that how we treat people who are experiencing crises in pregnancy, this all very links to other examples from Irish history of forced adoption, of Magdalene laundries, that the way that both society and law have been set up in such a way to govern reproduction and sexuality means that women who kind of stepped outside of those narrow confines were punished in multiple ways.
Thank you for lifting that aspect of the ways in which laws and policies were disciplining women and their sexuality, as well as being held to be at fault should they miscarry. We see that a lot in the United States right now, and in the very restrictive states, and the increasing stigma around trying to access abortion care. So with that in mind, I'd like to turn back to Dyuti and Lorraine and to talk about your paper, which explores people's experiences and expectations with the Irish abortion service following the reform, right? What were some of the biggest mismatches between what people expected and what they actually encountered in seeking care?
Thank you for that question. So first of all, I think women that we interviewed, so 24 women out of a sample of 30 who accessed early abortion care in community settings, a significant number of them out of the 24 who sought early medical abortions ended up calling their GPs as the first point of contact. And they were actually quite surprised to not getting the support that they thought was made available with the change in legislation post the referendum of 2018. And that was quite shocking for them. And I think part of the reason, like Lorraine mentioned earlier, is that there is not a publicly available list of abortion care providers that's available to the general public. It's mediated through My Options helpline, which is maintained by the HSC, the Health Service Executive in Ireland. And the thing is, when we were doing this project, which was between 2020 and 21, advertisement for the My Options helpline wasn't great. It was very patchy in Dublin, which is the capital city, and it was almost non-existent outside of Dublin. So women didn't really know that they had to do it. So from some of the examples that we use in a co-authored piece is women being told by their GPs to go to a maternity hospital. And then the woman sort of goes to the webpage of the maternity hospital and chances upon the My Options helpline and thinks that My Options helpline is a counseling service, but gives a call nonetheless, and was completely surprised at the support that she received. So these kind of things existed, continue to exist. Something that I've been coming across in my own research at the moment is, again, sharing some of the anxieties around carrying a pregnancy to term with a maternity hospital and then being met with a lot of dissuasion. So those kind of things do exist, continue to exist. So dissuasion, not being helped by GPs, not knowing what the first port of call should be, which is the My Options helpline. Then the other thing is with the 12-week gestational limit for early medical abortions. So at the Health Termination of Pregnancy, Regulation of the Termination of Pregnancy Act 2018, under its Section 12, basically allows for abortions to be carried out on request up until a gestational limit of 12 weeks. And that 12-week gestational limit is very, very rigid. So if you're someone who's coming up to 12 weeks or are in any sort of doubt that your termination might not be completed in the 12 weeks plus 0 days, you still stand the risk of having to travel abroad or having to import pills illegally to complete the termination. And that shadow of the 12-week gestational limit still remains, and it's still coming up in some of the research that I'm currently undertaking. If you wanted to add anything, Lorraine, to that discussion.
I think you've hit on all the points there, Dyuti, but I think, I suppose one of the main things is the lack of local availability of abortion care. Like, we interviewed people who described having to be on a bus for 3 hours to access an abortion provider. And I know this is something that is a huge, huge problem in the US at the moment as well. There have been improvements in terms of the number of abortion providers coming on board since the introduction of the Act, which is a really, really good thing. But again, the pathways to care, because my options isn't well known, that's the first step. We did have interviewees tell us that they went to the accident and emergency room, or just walked into a hospital to try and access an abortion, and then not being met very kindly in that situation in terms of just trying to access care. So I think it's really like a lack of knowledge and information sharing about what the steps are and how to access the care.
Let's definitely put a pin in that gap, because I'd like to come back to that. But in staying with the two of you just for a moment longer, your article underscores the gatekeeping notion as a big impediment to accessing care even after liberalization. So I just wondered if you could flesh that out a little bit more for our listeners.
So in terms of gatekeeping, so for example, one of the cases that we discuss in the article is of a woman who was experiencing hyperemesis in her second pregnancy and basically went to a maternity hospital, and she was basically in the hospital told that she wasn't dehydrated enough to be given the support that she needed, and she was very upset by it. But the doctor who saw her in the hospital was very kind and admitted her, let her lay down, and then guided her towards a social worker and a perinatal midwife. And through their support, she was able to then go back home. And then she basically set up an appointment with her own GP, a female GP, and in a clinic that advertised itself as a women's health clinic. And she went there and she found out that the tone of her GP, a female GP, was kind of judgmental and trying to figure out, why she was seeking an abortion. She felt like she had to justify her decision quite a lot. And then in the end, she wasn't even offered abortion care by her GP. So she felt like extremely let down by her GP, who she had been with for 15 years at that point. And that was the first sort of gatekeeping moment that she experienced. So GPs, again, can become a source of barrier, gatekeepers. Then the other example that we use is, again, it was a story shared by a service provider themselves of their Indian patient who went to the pharmacy thinking that they could get information about abortion care and being told that it wasn't available in Ireland. In fact, this was after it was legalized. And the woman ended up ordering abortion pills from India to Ireland and going through the process and then coming up to the GP for whatever care. And again, at various points, what we saw throughout the process of doing that piece of research was coming up against these kind of gatekeepers at various points. So GPs as gatekeepers, pharmacists as gatekeepers, And that was a real problem. And then also the other thing that Lorraine mentioned was the geographical distribution of care was rather skewed. So there were lots of providers in Dublin, and expectedly so, but the northwest of the country was not served really well. So that was a huge thing as well.
Yeah, I would just add that under the section on access to risk to health, including mental health, in order to access an abortion under that provision, you need to have approval from 2 perinatal psychologists. Now, there's only a small number of perinatal psychologists in the country. It's extremely difficult pathway to navigate for a patient. You need to be referred from your consultant obstetrician. So you need to get there in the first instance. And abortion is such a time sensitive issue. And really there's massive delays in terms of accessing care under that pathway. So I think that's another massive gatekeeper there is actually the pathway. And even though the legislation doesn't specify that you need 2 perinatal psychologists, that appears to be the practice. So that's another massive issue as well.
Just to add to that, the context for this, Mindy, is that in Ireland for so long, we were very hung up in the media discourse, the political discourse around suicide and abortion and kind of what level of risk to self constituted grounds for abortion. So this is a really kind of painful context for women in Ireland, because for a long time there's been extensive public discussion about what level of suffering, what level of risk to self is sufficient for you to be granted this quote unquote worst case scenario in extremis access to abortion care.
Yeah, I think it's massively building on the X case that Niamh is, I suppose, referring to there. And for anyone who's not aware of the X case, give it a Google, because the conditions surrounding that case was just absolutely horrendous for that young woman. And yeah, I think there's still so many barriers under the mental health section of this legislation, which given the context is really quite mad.
Yeah. Also, Lorraine, under the fatal fetal anomaly section as well, there are lots of, it has to be agreed upon by a multidisciplinary team in terms of agreeing on the fetal viability in order for it to qualify. And all of these things take a lot of time. And you're constantly coming across as time sort of casting this shadow in terms of being able to access abortion. So that's a huge thing.
Yeah, so the interpretation of the legislation under fatal fetal anomaly is really, really conservative. So the legislation doesn't say anything about a multidisciplinary team, or it just states that 2 medical practitioners need to sign off to say that the fetus will die within 28 days of birth. Now, in medical terms, that's a really, really difficult thing to do, because given different diagnoses, different fetal anomalies, that you cannot guarantee that as a medical practitioner. So really the legislation just doesn't translate into medical practice, and that's a massive issue as well. So doctors, medical practitioners, they're working under a legislation that does not work for them. It's not really fit for purpose. So yeah, as you say, these things, they're all gatekeepers. They're all delays for women in terms of accessing care. So the current policy around, I suppose, convening a multidisciplinary team and reviewing the case as a team is a way of ensuring that doctors are backed up, that they are kind of covered in terms of the legislation because of this 28 days of life term that is within the legislation. And there's fear of litigation, and there's fear around, as I said earlier, it is still a criminal act under the legislation. So there is still that fear for providers as well.
Well, what you described seems both frustrating and very fraught for all people involved. And turning to that and bringing Niamh and all of you together in conversation, in all your studies, that context, which engenders silence and uncertainty and a lot of, it's really freighted with emotion. It really is at the top line in all of your research. And I'm just wondering if you could speak to how that situates abortion in Ireland culturally, and how that translates into the experiences of people seeking abortion care?
I think the reason that I was hesitating to come in there is I'm very conscious that I don't live in Ireland at present, and I haven't since the referendum and since the legislation came into effect at the beginning of 2019. I mean, I think we can see in how the services have been set up some degree of cultural acceptance in that there was at least an attempt to embed early medical abortion within general practice and within primary care, which is obviously, again, if we contrast to the American situation, very, very different, where abortion care has really been exceptionalized and really set outside of any other kind of medical or hospital or primary care infrastructure. However, as Lorraine and Dyuti have been referring to, because it's an opt-out service and a large number of GPs in certain geographical locations do opt out, we have women living in areas where they perhaps feel very unsupported. Even if they do get in contact with the correct helpline, they realize that they're going to have to travel within Ireland in order to access the care that they want to access. And so I think there's positive will there, but in terms of how it actually played out. And of course, if we're thinking about, I think we talked earlier about that intersection between policy and legislation, but if we think about kind of culture and legislation, 14 weeks is an extremely early and intransigent cutoff. There are many women who might not, 12 weeks, and there are many women who might not discover until shortly before or even long after their cutoff that they are in fact pregnant. And if I suppose I could just make one kind of parallel to the situation here in Scotland, notionally in the UK, the reason that a lot of Irish women do travel to the UK is that abortion is available for quote unquote social reasons until 24 weeks. However, women cannot travel to Scotland post 20 weeks because women in Scotland are almost invariably not provided with abortion post 20 weeks. So even within the UK, we have Scottish women travelling often to London to non-NHS services to receive abortion care post 20 weeks. So I think within both the UK and Ireland, and perhaps to a greater extent in Ireland, any cultural acceptance of abortion lessens as pregnancy progresses, and the notion of second trimester abortion is particularly fraught and I would say not particularly culturally accepted.
Yeah, I couldn't have agreed more when you say that it's, especially when it transitions into the second trimester, it's not culturally accepted. And the other huge thing about sort of how abortion is socially and structurally positioned in Ireland today, what also speaks to it is, again, the restrictive nature of it. It's grudgingly made available upon request up until 12 weeks. It's available in the community setting within the GP practice up to 9 weeks and 6 days, and upon the GP's referral in the maternity units up to 12 weeks and 0 days. I mean, that really speaks to the restrictive nature of it. Then the other huge thing, I think, which I did not have scope to touch upon is how it affects migrant women, especially because, again, right to travel is not something that is available for a lot of women on visas. So a lot of third country non-EU nationals would require an additional visa to travel to England to seek abortion care, for example. And to be able to manage the anxiety of having an unfinished termination post 12 weeks, and then having to think about the possibility of traveling to the UK for care when you don't have a visa is another thing. And this was the case that, again, this is prior to the legalization of abortions with an asylum seeker, Miss Y, who got pregnant out of rape in her own home country, found out she was pregnant in Ireland, tried to traveled to the UK for abortion care and was returned by the border guards to Ireland because she didn't have documentation to be there. And then, of course, there was a lot of chaos, and she was made to deliver on, I think, 20 weeks or 21 weeks via C-section. I mean, those kind of restrictions still remain and are magnified if you're not someone with passport privilege, essentially, in the country. The other thing is, and this is again something that's coming up quite a bit in my current research, is if you are undocumented in the country and you don't have a public personal service number, the PPSN, which gives you access to state subsidized abortion care, you have to pay out of pocket to receive that care from GP surgeries. And a lot of women might not have that money. So there are just lots of layers of complications and lots of layers of inequalities, cross-cutting inequalities that affect different women's ability to access abortion care in Ireland at the moment, even after legalization.
And I suppose there we do, not to always bring it back to the American context, but there is a social difference there in that I haven't heard much discussion in the Irish context of use of public funds to quote unquote pay for abortion. But yet, that's not to, as Dyuti has said, to say that everything is perfect, far from it in the Irish context, because there are, a certain number of women in Ireland who just do not have access to that public option, who would be forced to pay. And there's very little discussion of how their needs are met or how they're not being provided with access to that care.
Yeah, just to come in there and pick up on some of the stuff that's been said. So I suppose what is unique in Ireland is that we do have community care at GP level, that is something unique, and that is something that we can kind of say it's good. We can lead the way in this. Of course, there's loads of problems with that, as we mentioned, in terms of there not being a public list, not every provider being a provider. There's many GPs who are non-providers. They're supposed to have the obligation to refer. They don't refer. So within that, there are restrictions, but for the most part, those who are providing community care level, it is working well. In the first kind of couple of months of the introduction of abortion care, we did see protests outside of GP clinics who do provide, and outside some hospitals as well. We thankfully do have exclusion zone legislation now that took many years and lots of pushing at grassroots level to get that introduced, but we do have that. And we do have instances where there's still protests and they're just outside of the, whatever amount of yards you have to be away, and they still protest there. But, I suppose just thinking back to the time of the campaign, and people said, the hospitals are going to be overwhelmed with so many women accessing abortions that they wouldn't possibly be able to cope. There'd be so many women. We can see that that's not the case. It's been embedded as a service, the same as any other. And it's about kind of just, I suppose, improving and building on that service and making sure that it is embedded in the service, that it's not a service that's siloed, that's off to one side of the hospital, and that not everyone talks about. But yeah, I guess there was one other issue where picking up on that instance of embedding within hospital care. So we do know of a hospital that is providing abortion care, and there was an instance where a member of the catering staff refused to make a woman a cup of tea because she was there to have an abortion. Now, that member of the staff should not have known her reason for being there in the first instance. And, there is definitely stigma within the provision of abortion services in the country. That's important to note. And I suppose we need to just make sure that that kind of instance does come with consequences, that that's not accepted. And I suppose just breaking down the stigma as best as we can.
So I have a few more questions, one that follows on this discussion, but I'm just going to park that to the side to get to something that SRHM is really trying to promote, which is the use of evidence, good, sound, empirical social science and public health evidence to improve health policy and outcomes, to really undergird advocacy. And I'm wondering if you could speak to the way in which your research perhaps has been used, has been communicated to either policymakers, legislatures, NGO advocates, the civil society, has been used, or how you hope it could be used. I wonder if you could reflect a little bit on that.
Yeah, so I suppose in terms of the WHO study that myself and Dyuti were working on, so in the interviews, we initially found that a lot of women were speaking about lack of pain relief. A lot of women spoke about passing out because of pain and the pain just being really overwhelming. That was something that kind of came to our attention very quickly and was a recommendation from our report that adequate pain relief be administered. And we know that that recommendation was taken up, and another, I suppose, policy that was introduced that didn't really work was that women were initially to attend 3 appointments at the GP, which is a huge amount of appointments, particularly when you have to travel for care. And in the first instance, there was consultation with the doctor. And then the second time you pick up your pill and you take the pill in front of the doctor in the doctor's office. Now, in reality, that meant that women were having to get on a bus or drive several hours home and experience cramping and the beginning of the abortion stages at a time when they're in travel. So that is something that we alerted to policymakers as well, that this was not safe. This was dangerous for women and that needed to be changed. So then with the introduction of, I suppose, when COVID hit, there was the introduction of telemedicine, and we looked at the possibility of collecting the pill, not needing to take it in front of the doctor. And that has been continued. So now 1 appointment in person is necessary. The other 2 appointments are over the phone. So a follow-up call at the end to make sure everything is okay. So your follow-up care. And then the first one where you initially talk through the experiences of it. And then the only in-person is when you go to collect the pills. As I say, you don't need to take them in front of the doctor. So they were kind of very, I think, important things that were picked up on as part of our research as well. Another issue that we outlined was delays in terms of scanning. So initially there was huge delays and the people who needed to go for scans were sent to a privatized scanning clinics because there was a lack of training within the hospitals and from GPs. So that is something that has been picked up on as well. And most of the scanning is done in the hospital now on site. So that is another positive as well, because it means it's less travel for the patient as well.
If I could just add to that, sorry, Mindy, I would really hope that my work, in addition to Dyuti and Lorraine's work, I think it provides strong evidence of the harm that arises from the very strict 12 weeks limit in Ireland. So we knew even pre-repeal, we had evidence that a strict 12-week limit was going to engender harm. And I would hope that kind of collectively our work could be used as evidence to further liberalise abortion care in Ireland in relation to that kind of cutoff.
Yeah, and just kind of building on your research, Niamh, we know that when abortion is illegal, it still happens. Women still have abortions. They're just more dangerous. And I think your research really speaks to that. And I guess that's what we want to portray as well, is that it's about making it safe for women, because they will happen anyway.
The question that I wanted to ask all of you is, to us from the outside of Ireland, the story of repeal is a tremendous victory. Parties in the streets, access to abortion legal in Ireland. And who would have thought that could possibly ever be achieved? And yet what your research, both before liberalization and after, points to are still the barriers of access and care. So what lessons do you think should be drawn from your research and applied in other country contexts? Or what would you like to say in response to Ireland as a success story? Over to all of you.
there's a lot to celebrate, right? In terms of celebrating a collective groundswell, in terms of shifting attitudes towards the topic of governing women's reproductive bodies. So I think in terms of that there's a lot to celebrate. There's a lot to take inspiration from in terms of the grassroots activism that led to the success of repeal. Different kinds of grassroots groups, lawyers, advocacy groups done by doctors in terms of the campaign. So that was all a big positive in terms of making repeal happen. I mean, we had a citizens' assembly before the vote, before the referendum, and the political establishment was actually quite surprised at how progressive some of the suggestions in the citizens' assembly were. The recommendations from the citizens' assembly were much more progressive than what the law is at this point. So public opinion and perception in Ireland on the topic of reproductive rights is ahead of the political class. However, because of a very noisy pro-life, the anti-choice, there's no point calling them pro-life because they're just anti-choice. The noisy presence of anti-choice activists in Ireland, a lot of them getting funds from US lobby groups. That's just documented. It's because of the fear of their existence and the fear of their voice that, the political establishment just didn't tilt the needle at where public perception was and public opinion was. So I think in terms of drawing inspiration, yes, I think that there is a lot that the Irish case has to offer in terms of what grassroots activism can achieve, in terms of rendering a very resounding victory in a referendum. And I think that's something to celebrate. In terms of embedding early abortion care in the community is also it de-exceptionalizes abortion care as abortion care, and also sort of helps prevent a lot of especially, I know it's kind of a double-edged sword in terms of a publicly available list of providers not being available. However, My Options helps in cocooning these service providers. So because these noisy anti-choice advocates don't know at times who these providers are, they cannot sit outside a GP provider's office at their clinic and advocate. So I think that really shifts the equation as well. So there are lots of positives in terms of what has been achieved. And it's not all doom and gloom, but yeah, it still remains a highly, highly restrictive context. And there's just no other way of saying it.
Just to echo what Dyuti was saying there, we advocated for free, safe, legal abortion, and we did achieve that. There are lots of barriers in place that we spoke about, but it just really shows that grassroots activism does work. It takes a lot of work, and it takes strong collective action together, but it does work. And it's not that the Irish government one day woke up and said work on abortion legislation. No, it was constant advocacy for years. It was so in their face that there was no escaping it. We were just hounding politicians morning, noon and night relentlessly for years. And unfortunately, so many women died or suffered horrendously throughout the years as well in that advocacy as well. But it is possible, and I think just a lot to be said for collective action and grassroots activism. I think we need to keep it up. So even though, we have, free, safe, legal, we need to keep up that activism. And especially right now, given the political context around the world, we need to make sure that abortion is still on the agenda, and that it always is, and that we continue to advance it and work on it. In terms of, My Options and the cocooning of providers, I agree with that. We are starting to see I've noticed now some GPs put abortion services as a list on their website as one of the services that they provide. I think that's a really, really great step forward, and it shows that we are moving along. And yeah, I think just to reiterate the importance of that grassroots activism to keep that hope that you can improve the situation, you know.
I would back up what Lorraine says. You know, I'm always conscious of the women who have died and who have suffered so much prior to us getting to this point. I was at a seminar recently and someone said, oh, the Irish referendum 2017. And not to be annoying, I did correct them and say it was 2018 and the legislation came into effect in 2019, because I'm always conscious, you know, up until that legislation came into effect, women were suffering, women were traveling, women were being forced to continue with pregnancies or to seek kind of unsafe abortion care. In terms of the future and in terms of what other countries can aim for, I think in Ireland, we did change the terms of the debate somewhat. We did move away from that kind of really dominant discourse of how suicidal do you need to be. We brought, you know, into the public domain stories about terminations for medical reasons. We brought into the public domain, you know, the story of Savita Halappanavar and told that story again and again and again. There's still definitely work to be done. You know, we don't tell enough stories about the mundane, everyday, non-dramatic abortions that people require for non-dramatic reasons. You know, not every story of pregnancy and abortion involves kind of a huge degree of suffering and trauma. That's part of the normalization of abortion, is sometimes it is a mundane aspect of people's lives. And yeah, I just think we need to change the terms of the debate to, you know, non-exceptional care, to care that is funded by public money, care that is both health care and a human right, and, you know, that it's kind of be more on the offensive and less having the terms of the debate dictated to us by anti-choice interests.
And if I can just add to Niamh's point just quickly, since you mentioned Savita Halappanavar and you began the discussion by talking about miscarriage care can only be provided when abortion care is available in a country. Savita Halappanavar was this 32-year-old Indian woman who suffered a miscarriage and ended up retaining fetal matter. And that fetal matter, like, you know, they found a fetal heartbeat and was denied a DNC. And I think that is just so important to not lose sight of. She was denied miscarriage care because abortion care wasn't available in Ireland at the time. So the intersecting and sort of overlapping nature of reproductive health care and maternal health care that just needs to be legalized and needs to be made available in order to be able to provide services for women to ensure that women don't die in need. Yeah.
Well, thank you, all of you. We've come to really the end of the hour. I thank all of you both for your research, your continued work, both as scientists and advocates on behalf of sexual and reproductive health and rights, and on behalf of SRHM, the staff and the community. I thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Mindy. Thanks.
Thanks for joining us for this insightful conversation. Please check the show notes for a link to the SRHM Journal, which is available online and open access. Follow us on social media and sign up for our newsletter to receive notifications for new publications. If you're enjoying this podcast, please subscribe, give us a rating, or leave a review. Sharing evidence-based and rights-grounded knowledge is our passion, and it's also critical to support the advocacy and actions that need to be taken to improve SRHR for all. We would very much appreciate it. Thank you for supporting the SRHM Podcast, which is produced by our staff. The music was composed by Tiber Christian and Salomon Beautombe.